we're typically a church where the talking happens up there and the silence happens from down there. But I thought I'd begin tonight with a question, and it's a question that if you know the answer, you'll immediately know that you know the answer. There is only one correct answer. If you're uncertain, then you don't know the answer. The question is, and you can say it out loud, what is the answer to the ultimate question about life, the universe, and everything? I've heard a few things. What? Not 21? No, not 21? 42. 42 is the answer to the ultimate question about life, the universe, and everything. Now, some of you are looking a little bit confused. That comes from Douglas Adams's comedic science fiction story, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which began, I believe, as a serialized radio show, turned into a book. It's been movies, it's been TV shows, it's been just about everything. But in the story, there are these group of pan-dimensional beings who create a supercomputer known as Deep Thought. And Deep Thought's job is to calculate the answer to the ultimate question about life, the universe, and everything. And they realize it's going to take Deep Thought about 7.5 million years to do this. And so when the 7.5 million year mark approaches, people are gathered around, all excited to hear the answer to the ultimate question about life, the universe, and everything. And as Deep Thought calculates, it eventually spits out the simple, unambiguous answer, 42. That is the answer. And of course, some of the people there are exactly like some people here tonight are. Like, what kind of an answer is that? And is that all you've got after 7.5 million years? That's the best answer you can give. And Deep Thought answers in the story, I checked it very thoroughly. And quite definitely, that is the answer. I think the problem, to be quite honest with you, is that you've never actually known what the question is. And so they asked Deep Thought, well, can he give them the question? And he said, well, no, it's not powerful enough to do that, but it can help these pan-dimensional beings to create an even more powerful computer that will take 10 million years to find out the question to the answer to the question about life, the universe, and everything. And so Deep Thought helps these pan-dimensional creatures to create this more powerful supercomputer, which turns out to be the planet Earth. And the pan-dimensional creatures assume the form of white lab mice in labs to observe the running of this computer. But 5 minutes short of 10 million years, an alien race known as the Vogons destroy the Earth to make way for a new hyperspace bypass. And so we never actually find out the question to the answer to the ultimate question about life, the universe, and everything. Now, it's really a ridiculous comedic story, but the interaction between Deep Thought and the bystanders, as they're waiting for the answer, has a significant truth that it portrays to us. And the truth is this: if you don't ask the right questions, you won't get the right answers. Or if you do get answers, you won't quite know what to make of those answers because you're not asking the right questions. Well, as we've seen, Ecclesiastes is something of a memoir of Solomon's attempt to find meaning for life under the sun, life that is lived apart from God, apart from submission to God. And Solomon begins very much like Deep Thought in chapter 1, verse 2, by giving the answer. Here's the answer. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. There's his answer. If you want to know what life under the sun is like, it's vanity. That's the answer. But unlike Deep Thought, Solomon knows this because he knows the right question to ask. And the question is there in verse 3. This is the question that he's asking, that he's answering throughout the book. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? That's the question, and verse 2 is the answer. He knows both the question and the answer. But to show that, like Deep Thought in Douglas Adams' story, that he has checked very thoroughly and that quite definitely is the answer, he presents a number of arguments to show this is why I've reached this conclusion. And last Sunday night, we looked at 3 of those arguments that he presents for futility under the sun. And those were the inevitability of death, the impossibility of satisfaction, and the instability of novelty. Those are 3 arguments that he presents that life has no meaning if it is only lived under the sun. And tonight we're going to consider 2 more arguments to back up his answer to his question. And those two considerations tonight are the insufficiency of education in verses 12 to 15 and the illusion of enjoyment in verses 16 to 18. So let's have a look at these things. First of all, I want to talk about the insufficiency of education. Solomon shows here that education, I'll explain that in a moment, is insufficient to provide ultimate meaning and purpose and satisfaction in life. Look at me in verse 12. It says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under the sun. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Now, before we dig into these verses, let me just stress once again, in case you missed it, that Solomon is talking about life under the sun. This is life that is lived apart from God. Where do we find meaning if we try to live life apart from God? Or as he calls it in verse 13 here, wisdom for all that is done under heaven. We're dealing here with life that is lived without submission to God. Now, by the way, Solomon knows, we know this from the book of Proverbs, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. But what he's dealing with in this particular section is not heavenly wisdom. In these particular verses, he's dealing with earthly wisdom. He's dealing with what I've called education. Now, we live in a world that idolizes education, a world that suggests that education is the solution to every problem. All you need to do to make life's problems dissipate is to sufficiently educate people. If they're sufficiently educated, poof, the problems go away. Solomon's saying thousands of years ago, he tried that, and guess what? He didn't find satisfaction. He didn't find meaning as he pursued this ultimate education. Solomon tried centuries ago to find meaning in knowledge and education and inquiry, and he came up empty. And many others have come to realize the same thing over the years. There's a man by the name of Daniel Tammet, who is an English writer, and in March 2004, he broke the European record for reciting pi from memory. Now, pi is that, 3.1459, etc., etc., etc. I won't try to give you what the mathematical thing is because I'll bash it up horribly. But in theory, pi can possibly have a last number, I'm told. But no one's ever actually quite figured out what that last number is. Well, early in his life, Tammet was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which gives him heightened ability in tasks like learning languages and mathematical stuff. When he decided to study Icelandic, he became fluent in it after a week because he's just, that's how his mind works. And on the 14th of March 2004, it took him 5 hours and 9 minutes to, without error, recite 22,514 digits of pi. This is an intelligent guy. That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay. But in his memoir, he recalls lying on his bedroom floor as a teenager, staring at the ceiling and trying to picture the universe in his head so that he can arrive, in his words, at a concrete understanding of, quote-unquote, everything. And he writes, in that instant, I felt really unwell, and I can feel my heart beating inside me because for the first time I had realized that thought and logic had limits and could only take a person so far. This realization frightened me, and it took me a long time to come to terms with. In other words, he realized that education and logic and knowledge cannot provide him with ultimate meaning and ultimate satisfaction, and that thought frightened him. Well, Solomon came to the same conclusion centuries ago, long before Daniel Tammet, long before any of us realized that human wisdom and knowledge has its limits. Education in and of itself is simply insufficient to provide meaning and satisfaction in life under the sun. Solomon, for the first time in the book here, begins speaking in the first person. And he talks about this great wisdom that God had given to him. He's not making an empty boast here. We know that this is a biblical claim, that God gave him greater wisdom than anyone who had ever lived. And he says in verse 12 that he applied, verse 12 and verse 13, I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under the heaven. That is, he applied his mind to every human discipline that he could think of to see if this education, if this knowledge would make a difference to the seeming futility of life. And we sometimes draw a distinction between knowledge and wisdom. And sometimes that's appropriate. But Even in the way that we draw that distinction, if we say that knowledge is simply knowing facts and wisdom is knowing how to use those facts, you can't have wisdom without the knowledge, first of all. You have to know the facts in order to know how to use them properly. The Bible tells us that Solomon had great wisdom, knowing how to solve difficult problems. So that very first instance when those two women came and there were two children, and one was dead and one was alive, and each one claimed that they were that she was the mother of the living child. And Solomon figured out the way to get to the answer, and everyone was amazed at his wisdom. But at the same time, the Bible tells us that Solomon was like a walking Wikipedia. He just had this encyclopedic knowledge of everything that existed. We're told in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 33, that he had knowledge of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and birds and reptiles and fish. In 1 Kings chapter 10, when the queen of Sheba visited Solomon, hearing of his great wisdom, she brought her most difficult trivia questions. But the Bible tells us that Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. If formal degrees were a valued thing back in 1000 BC, Solomon would have had all of them. He would have had all those little letters behind his name. And yet, notice Solomon's conclusion. Despite all this knowledge, despite the fact that, and this didn't just necessarily pour by osmosis into his head. He said, I applied my heart. I worked hard to figure out the answer to all these things. I educated myself as much as possible. And what was his conclusion after all of that? The second part of verse 13, it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I like the way the Christian Standard Bible translates this. It says, God has given to people this miserable task to keep them occupied. It's like people are just searching after knowledge and they're just keeping themselves occupied by learning more and more things, and yet it doesn't ultimately bring meaning. This is a reality that resonates or should resonate with many. In fact, it's interesting. I was talking to someone after last Sunday night that if you read Solomon and you listen to the way that many atheists talk today, they talk very much like Solomon, except they think that they've found the meaning when Solomon's saying, actually, you haven't found the meaning. So, for example, the late astrophysicist Stephen Hawking, this is what he said of humanity. He said, quote, we are just an advanced breed of monkeys in a minor planet of a very average star, but we can understand the universe. That's what gives us meaning, because we can understand, because we can educate ourselves, because we know things. That's what gives us meaning. That's what gives us purpose. Solomon says, no, I tried that, and I found that it was also futility. It was a 3-part television documentary in which atheist Richard Dawkins was asked, why does an atheist bother to get up in the morning? And he says, well, the answer will be different for different people, but for me personally, it's the awe and wonder of scientific inquiry that keeps me going. The more I can learn about the way the world works, that's what gives me purpose. That's what helps me to get up every morning. Solomon's saying, I tried that, and I found that kind of existence was ultimately purposeless. Now, of course, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with knowledge. And if you're studying something, do your best to master it. Do your best to learn as much as you can about it. God has given us inquisitive minds that are fed by such inquiry. But we must realize the insufficiency of such inquiry, the insufficiency of education, the insufficiency of knowledge to lead us to meaning in life. Solomon says in verse 14, I have seen everything that is done under the sun. In other words, I pursued all this knowledge, I learned all these things, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. It's like chasing the wind. It's like seeing the trees blow on a windy day and running after the wind and trying to catch it. You're not going to do it. It's meaningless. It's purposeless. Trying to find meaning in scientific inquiry or any other form of education is like trying to grab hold of the wind. It just won't work. And Solomon says, here's why it won't work. He gives us a proverb in verse 15. He gives us 2 reasons very quickly why scientific inquiry is insufficient to provide meaning. He says in verse 15, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Here's the 2 things. First of all, the first reason that education is insufficient is because education cannot fix life's problems in and of itself. It cannot fix life's problems. What is crooked cannot be made straight. What he's saying is that there's always something in life that doesn't seem right. There's something that seems bent out of shape. We have relational conflict, and it's just not right. There is injustice, and there is government corruption and incompetence, and there's financial instability, and there's physical disability and death. There's our own sinful inclinations, and we look at it and we know that there's something wrong here. But all the knowledge in the world cannot fix those problems. You can know everything that there is to know, and it won't fix the problem in and of itself. You can educate yourself silly, but you cannot solve all your problems through education. The second reason that education is insufficient is because education can never exhaust itself. Second part of verse 15, what is lacking cannot be counted. In other words, no matter how much knowledge you have, there is always something else that you don't know. You will never be able to exhaust knowledge of anything that you study. No matter how many degrees you have, you will never know all there is to know. If education is the key to meaning, you will never find ultimate meaning, because ultimate knowledge will always evade you. Pursue education to your heart's content, but you will always be ignorant of something, and you will never know what it is that you're ignorant of. So here's Solomon's point in the section. Solomon's point is that we know that there is something wrong with life. Douglas O'Donnell says, then, when we witness life under the sun, scarred by suffering, overflowing with oppression, infected with injustice, crawling with crime, traumatized by terrorists, polluted with impurity, we know that this is not just the way things are. We know that this isn't the way that God created things to be. Something has gone wrong. We know that intrinsically. But while wisdom and knowledge can highlight those problems, they cannot fix those problems. That's what Solomon is saying. And so the first thing that he gives us in this particular section is the insufficiency of education to provide meaning for life. The second principle that he gives us is the illusion of enjoyment. Look in verse 16. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. Those words, madness and folly, Solomon's the only one in the book of Ecclesiastes who uses those particular words. And the way he uses them, he's not talking of wisdom and folly in the sense of stupidity. The way that he uses them, he uses them always to speak of chasing immoral behavior, chasing immoral pleasures. I perceive that this is also but a striving after the wind, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So he says here that he had tried and he had failed to find meaning in education, and so he turned his pursuits elsewhere. And specifically, he used his surpassing knowledge to pursue madness and folly. In other words, he used his wisdom, this God-given gift, to pursue godless enjoyment, godless pleasures. If he wasn't going to find meaning in education, in learning all these facts and getting all these degrees, well, he's going to try to live like the world and do all the things that the world proposes. This is where you find enjoyment. And he's going to live like a rank unbeliever and see, is that where I'm going to find ultimate meaning? Is that where I'm going to find ultimate pleasure? If meaning could not be found in education, perhaps it could be found in enjoyment. But again, he says that debauched revelry failed to produce meaning and satisfaction. He says this too, in verse 17, the second sentence in verse 17, I perceive that this also is but a striving after the wind. Now again, this is people are pursuing the same thing today, aren't they? That people pursue their own pleasures, convinced that that is where they're going to find meaning. In the same documentary that I mentioned, Richard Dawkins asked atheist comedian Ricky Gervais about the meaning of life. Where do you find meaning, Ricky, in life? And Ricky Gervais replied that meaning in life is found in loving what you do and in centering your life around meaningful relationships. In other words, as long as you enjoy life, it's meaningful. Now, I don't watch a whole lot of Ricky Gervais, but when I do see clips of him on the internet, he seems like a guy who enjoys life. He seems to be having fun. He seems to laugh a lot. I suppose most comedians do. He seems to be enjoying life. But Solomon's saying that pursuing that kind of self-centered, self-fulfilling enjoyment is not going to provide meaning for you ultimately. Why? Because he says in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. He's saying that he used his God-given gift of wisdom to pursue this madness and folly, to pursue these worldly pleasures, these godless pleasures. But it didn't help him. Instead of helping him, he found that it only produced anger, vexation, and sorrow. It only made life more miserable as he pursued things that were dishonoring to God. Pursuing the pleasures offered by the world will never bring meaning to a human soul. Never bring the meaning that the human soul longs for. Contrary to what Ricky Gervais thinks, true meaning does not come from enjoyment. Pure enjoyment, says Solomon, once again, is chasing after the wind. You want to chase after the wind? Try to find meaning in education. Try to find meaning in enjoyment. It's not going to happen. You're not going to catch the wind. You're not going to find meaning in those things. So once again, this sounds pretty depressing. You know, we listen to these things, and like I come here on a Sunday night to be encouraged, and this doesn't sound very encouraging. And let me just say this, by the way, if you read this and you don't seem very encouraged by it, then Solomon has actually achieved his goal, because that's what he's trying to do. Solomon's trying to show you that you're not going to find meaning under the sun. But the reason he wants to do that is to point you in the right direction, so that if you realize you're not going to find meaning under the sun, you're going to start looking for it somewhere else, and then perhaps you're going to find the right answers. He wants his readers to know that life is hopeless under the sun. Those who live under the sun, those who live merely under the sun, are without hope because they are without God in the world. But again, Solomon wants you to feel the weight of that meaninglessness so that you know where to look by meaning. Solomon, in other words, in this piece of wisdom literature, Solomon's goal really is to destroy earthly wisdom so that he can point you to heavenly wisdom. And perhaps that sounds familiar to you. Perhaps the thought of destroying earthly wisdom, of destroying the wisdom of the wise, perhaps that rings a bell in your head. Because Solomon is actually following God in doing this very thing. God said to Isaiah chapter 29, verse 14, I will again do wonderful things with this people, with wonder upon wonder, and the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the discernment of their discerning men shall be hidden. God's saying that a time is coming where I'm going to do something that will destroy the wisdom of the wise, that will hide the discerning of those that claim to be wise. It'll hide the discernment of the discerning. And how did that happen? Well, the New Testament gives us the answer to that, doesn't it? Paul, in fact, quotes this verse from Isaiah chapter 29 in the New Testament. Listen to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. In other words, God said to Isaiah, I'm going to do something. Isaiah, I'm going to do something that is going to destroy the wisdom of the wise. And Paul says, let me tell you what God did. God sent Jesus Christ to a cross. And in the cross of Christ, he demolished the wisdom of the wise. Solomon's saying you're not going to find that kind of meaning that you're looking for under the sun. Paul is saying there is a place where you can find the meaning that you're looking for. You can find that meaning in the cross of Christ. The cross of Christ reminds us that education is not life's ultimate pursuit, and that enjoyment is not life's ultimate pursuit. Paul says that, in fact, not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. Godly wisdom realizes that I'm not going to find wisdom under the sun. And so I need to look to the cross of Christ, which destroys the wisdom of the wise, to find ultimate purpose, to find ultimate meaning, to find ultimate satisfaction. Godly wisdom also understands, by the way, that not everything that is broken under the sun needs to be immediately fixed, at least. Like Christ, Doug mentioned earlier when talking about the name of God that we're focusing on. Sometimes wisdom requires us to entrust ourselves to the one who judges righteously. Jesus Christ was wronged, and he didn't immediately insist that it be fixed right now. He simply entrusted himself to the one who would judge righteously, trusting that ultimately, on the final day of judgment, God will right all wrongs, and that he will reveal that indeed everything has worked together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. So let me say this. If you're here tonight and you're searching for meaning in education, you're searching for meaning in enjoyment, let me encourage you to stop chasing the wind. You're not going to catch it. Instead, pursue Jesus Christ and find in Him everything you need for meaning and for lasting satisfaction in this life and in the life to come. Let's pray. Father, we do thank you again for the wisdom of Solomon, and thank you that you gave Solomon the inclination to seek meaning under the sun, and that he was willing to pen his experiences so that we can learn from them. Lord, we pray that you just help us to realize that we will never find ultimate meaning under the sun, whether we're pursuing it in education, whether we're pursuing it in enjoyment, or any other means under the sun. Help us to realize that meaning and satisfaction will always ultimately be elusive. It'll be elusive until we look for meaning in the cross of Jesus Christ. Help us to do that, Lord. I pray if there is even one here tonight that has not yet done that has not yet looked to the cross of Jesus Christ for meaning, help them to realize that that's what they need to do. Stop finding purpose in education. Help them to stop finding purpose in senseless enjoyment and entertainment, and instead to look to Jesus Christ for fulfillment, for meaning, for salvation. We ask these things in Jesus' name.